Heath Ledger was not just an actor. He was a storm disguised as a smile, a flame that burned too bright for its own body. When he stepped into the shadowed shoes of the Joker, the world saw chaos perfected, madness elevated to art. But behind that haunting laugh was a man slowly being consumed by the very role that would make him immortal. This is not just the story of a legendary performance. It is the story of the price paid in silence, sleepless nights, and inner collapse. Before we go deeper into this unforgettable journey, take a moment to honor his legacy. Hit like, raise a thumb, and remember a genius who gave everything to his art. In the grand theater of Hollywood, where fame is often loud and fleeting, Heath Ledger stood apart like a quiet myth in motion. He was not built to chase applause. Applause chased him. To many, he was a chameleon, beautiful, unpredictable, dangerously talented. To others, he was a riddle, a man who smiled softly while carrying entire worlds of emotion behind his eyes. And yet, legends like him are rarely born from comfort. They are forged in pressure, shaped by doubt, and refined by an almost painful devotion to truth. Heath Ledger did not act to be seen. He acted to disappear. Each role was not a costume, but a transformation. Not a performance, but a surrender. And when the Joker arrived, it was not simply another character. It was a mirror reflecting the darkest corridors of the human mind. The world would later call it the greatest villain portrayal in cinematic history. But greatness, as history often reminds us, demands a price. This story is not meant to glorify suffering, nor to romanticize tragedy. It is meant to remember a human being behind the myth. A young man who believed that art should be honest, even if honesty hurt. A soul who crossed lines others feared to approach, because he believed meaning lived there. And perhaps most painfully, a reminder that brilliance does not make one invincible. As you watch this story unfold, ask yourself a quiet question. How many times do we celebrate the result while ignoring the cost? How often do we applaud the masterpiece without asking what it took from the artist to create it? If Heath Ledger's work ever moved you, unsettled you, or stayed with you long after the screen went dark, take a moment now. Leave a like. Leave a comment. Not for the algorithm, but as a small gesture of remembrance. Because legends live on only when we choose not to forget them. Heath Andrew Ledger was born far from the flashing lights of Hollywood, in the quiet city of Perth, Western Australia. Long before his face would be projected onto massive screens and etched into cinematic history, he was simply a boy growing up in a place where dreams felt distant and ordinary life moved slowly. His parents, Kim and Sally Ledger, raised him in a middle-class household that valued discipline, education, and stability. On the surface, it was a normal upbringing, but beneath that surface, something restless was already forming. From a young age, Heath was observant, introspective, and unusually sensitive to the emotional undercurrents around him. He was not the loudest child in the room, nor the one seeking attention. Instead, he watched. He listened. He absorbed. Teachers would later recall him as intelligent and creative, yet quietly detached, as if part of him was always somewhere else. While other children chased certainty, Heath was drawn to ambiguity, the spaces between right and wrong, laughter and sadness. His parents divorced when he was still young, an event that subtly but permanently altered the emotional architecture of his childhood. The separation introduced a sense of fracture, of instability, that Heath never openly dramatized, but clearly carried within him. Friends noticed that after the divorce, he became more inward, more private. Pain for him was not something to be displayed. It was something to be studied. School became both an escape and a battleground. Heath excelled academically, particularly in English and drama, where he discovered an early fascination with storytelling and character. Acting offered him something rare, a structured way to explore emotions that felt too complex to express as himself. On stage, he could borrow another identity, speak through another voice, and briefly quiet the confusion inside his own mind. Sports also played a role in his youth. Heath was an accomplished hockey player and even captained his school team. To the outside world, this painted a picture of balance, an athlete and an artist grounded and capable. But those closest to him sensed that the physical discipline of sport was less a passion and more a counterweight. It kept him anchored, but it did not define him. Drama, however, did. Teachers quickly recognized that Heath did not merely perform lines, he inhabited them. He asked questions other students did not ask. Why would a character lie here? What were they hiding? What did they fear? Even then, he was less interested in heroes than in flawed, broken figures. Characters with cracks fascinated him because they felt real. By his mid-teens, the idea of a conventional future had already lost its appeal. University, stable employment, predictable routines, these felt like cages rather than goals. Acting, on the other hand, offered risk, uncertainty, and total emotional exposure. Against advice from many adults around him, Heath made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would leave the safety of home and pursue acting professionally. At just 17, he dropped out of school and moved east with a friend, chasing auditions across Australia. It was a leap taken without guarantees, driven not by arrogance but by necessity. Acting was not something he wanted to try. It was something he felt he had to do. Failure was possible. Obscurity was likely. But not trying felt worse than either. Early roles came slowly. Small television parts, minor appearances, long stretches of rejection. Yet even in these beginnings, Heath showed a discipline that surprised casting directors. He prepared obsessively. He studied people in public spaces, noting how they walked, how they hesitated, how they hid discomfort behind smiles. These were not the habits of a man chasing fame. They were the habits of someone studying humanity. Those early years shaped him in profound ways. Rejection taught him resilience, but it also deepened his self-criticism. Each missed role became not just a professional setback, but a personal evaluation. Was he good enough? Was he honest enough? Was he going far enough? These questions would follow him for the rest of his life, growing louder as his success increased. By the time Heath Ledger set his sights on Hollywood, he was no longer an innocent dreamer. He was a young man already familiar with doubt, isolation, and the pressure of self-expectation. The foundation of his genius, his empathy, his intensity, his willingness to suffer for authenticity, had been laid long before the world knew his name. And it was this foundation, both fragile and powerful, that would eventually carry him upward, and pull him dangerously close to the edge. When Heath Ledger arrived on the international stage, he did not arrive with noise. There were no scandals, no aggressive self-promotion, no carefully manufactured persona. Instead, he entered quietly, almost cautiously, carrying with him the discipline of his early struggles and a growing hunger to be taken seriously. Hollywood, however, had its own plans for him. His early breakthrough roles quickly revealed a contradiction that would follow him for years. Heath was undeniably handsome, effortlessly charismatic, and camera-friendly. Casting directors saw a leading man, studios saw commercial potential, audiences saw a romantic figure they could admire from a distance. But Heath saw a trap. The industry's initial embrace came with invisible chains, roles that were safe, predictable, and emotionally shallow. Films like 10 Things I Hate About You brought him global attention, but they also placed him in a box he never asked to enter. Teen idol, heartthrob, marketable face. The success was real, but it felt hollow. Behind the scenes, Heath was deeply uneasy. He feared becoming a surface-level actor, admired for appearance rather than substance. For him, fame without depth was a slow form of erasure. Instead of capitalizing on easy popularity, Heath made a choice that confused many around him. He began turning down roles that would have guaranteed stardom. He sought projects that carried risk, discomfort, and emotional complexity. This decision came at a cost. Offers slowed. Industry insiders questioned his judgment. Some warned him that Hollywood had little patience for actors who refused to play the game. But Heath was not interested in playing safe. He was interested in truth. Each role he accepted after that point was a deliberate act of rebellion against expectation. He gravitated toward characters who were fractured, morally ambiguous, or emotionally exposed. In Monsters Ball, he explored darkness without apology. In The Patriot, he tested the balance between heroism and brutality. With every performance, he chipped away at the shallow image others had built for him. The true turning point came with Brokeback Mountain. The role was not just challenging, It was dangerous in an industry still deeply uncomfortable with vulnerability, masculinity, and non-traditional love. Heath understood the risk immediately. The backlash was predictable. The misinterpretations were inevitable. But the truth of the character mattered more to him than public comfort. His performance was restrained, raw, and devastatingly human. He did not dramatize pain, he buried it. He did not explain emotion, he let it suffocate the character from within. Critics were stunned. Audiences were divided. And suddenly, Heath Ledger was no longer just a star. He was an actor of rare depth. Yet success did not bring relief. If anything, it intensified his internal pressure. Recognition raised expectations, and expectations sharpened his self-scrutiny. He became more obsessive about preparation, more demanding of himself, more intolerant of superficial storytelling. Each project had to justify its existence. Each role had to reveal something new, something uncomfortable. Behind closed doors, this relentless pursuit took a toll. Heath slept less, he isolated more. Friends noticed that he carried his characters long after filming ended, as if shedding them required an effort he did not know how to make. Work was not something he switched on and off. It followed him home. It occupied his silence. By the time he was firmly established in Hollywood, Heath Ledger had already won a quiet war against typecasting and doubt. But victory came with exhaustion. The higher he climbed, the narrower his path became. There was no room left for mediocrity, no permission to rest, no acceptable failure. And it was at this exact moment, when the world finally recognized his brilliance, that the most dangerous role of his life appeared on the horizon. A role that promised immortality, a role that demanded everything, and a role that would change him forever. By the mid-2000s, Heath Ledger had achieved what many actors spend a lifetime chasing: credibility. Not manufactured prestige, not temporary popularity, but genuine respect from peers, critics, and filmmakers who understood the difference. He was no longer discussed as a former heartthrob who got lucky with serious roles. He was now spoken of as a craftsman, deliberate, fearless, and uncompromising. Brokeback Mountain marked a seismic shift in how the industry viewed him. The performance was not loud, not showy, not designed for applause. It was internal, restrained, and emotionally devastating. Heath's Ennis Del Mar barely spoke his pain, yet every silence carried weight. Critics praised the honesty of the portrayal, noting how Ledger communicated decades of repression with the smallest physical choices. A lowered gaze, a clenched jaw, a voice that seemed permanently held back. Award nominations followed, but more importantly, something deeper changed. Hollywood began to trust him with complexity. With that trust came opportunity. Directors saw in Heath an actor willing to disappear completely, to abandon vanity in pursuit of truth. He was not interested in playing likable characters. He wanted believable ones. This mindset led him to a diverse range of projects, each chosen not for scale but for substance. He explored darkness without glamour, vulnerability without sentimentality, and ambition without ego. Yet, success did not soften him. If anything, it sharpened his internal demands. Each acclaimed role raised the bar he set for himself. Heath began to feel that repeating himself, even in success, was a kind of failure. Comfort was the enemy. Familiarity was a warning sign. He believed that if a role did not scare him, it probably was not worth doing. Publicly, his reputation soared. Privately, the cost accumulated. Fame brought scrutiny, expectation, and an unspoken contract. Now that he had proven himself, he was not allowed to fall. Interviews became more guarded. Praise made him uneasy. Compliments were received politely, but rarely internalized. To Heath, applause was not confirmation. It was pressure. At the same time, his personal life was shifting. Fatherhood introduced both grounding love and new responsibility. It gave him something real outside of work, but it also intensified his fear of failure. The stakes were no longer limited to his own identity. Every decision now carried weight beyond himself. Balancing artistic obsession with emotional presence became increasingly difficult. Industry insiders noticed a pattern. Heath prepared more intensely than ever before. Scripts were annotated obsessively, accents, movements, psychological backstories, nothing was left unexplored. He studied not only characters but philosophies, disorders, and extremes of human behavior. Acting for him had moved beyond profession. It had become a form of psychological excavation. And then came the offer that would redefine everything. When news spread that Heath Ledger had been cast as the Joker in The Dark Knight, the reaction was immediate and ruthless. Skepticism flooded the internet. Outrage followed. Fans questioned the decision openly, unable to reconcile the chaotic villain with the quiet intensity Heath was known for. Some dismissed the casting outright, calling it a mistake before a single frame was shot. Heath did not respond publicly, he rarely did. But those close to him understood something crucial. This was exactly the kind of challenge he could not refuse. The Joker was not a villain in the traditional sense. He was an idea, an embodiment of chaos, nihilism, and psychological terror. A character without a moral anchor, without a stable identity. To Heath, this was not just a role, it was an abyss. In accepting it, Heath stepped into the most dangerous phase of his career. The halo of fame was now complete. He had the industry's respect, the audience's attention, and a role that promised cinematic immortality. But halos cast shadows, and the brighter the light surrounding Heath Ledger became, the darker the path ahead quietly grew. When Heath Ledger began preparing for the Joker, he did not approach the role as a performance to be executed. He approached it as a psychological territory to be entered, and survived. From the very beginning, he understood that this version of the Joker could not be played safely. This was not a comic book villain driven by spectacle. This Joker was an idea without limits, a force that thrived on moral collapse and emotional disorder. To portray him honestly meant going where reason dissolved. Heath chose isolation as his method. He withdrew from familiar routines, from social comfort, from the rhythms that had once grounded him. In hotel rooms and temporary apartments, he locked himself away with notebooks, music, and fragments of disturbing imagery. This was not preparation in the traditional sense, it was immersion. He kept a diary written in the Joker's voice, filled with fragmented thoughts, violent humor, and warped reflections on humanity. Page after page, the boundary between actor and character began to erode. Sleep became the first casualty. Heath struggled with insomnia long before the Joker, but now it intensified. Nights stretched endlessly. His mind refused to slow down. The Joker's voice did not switch off when the lights went out. Instead, it grew louder in the silence. Heath later admitted that he was sleeping only a few hours a night, his thoughts racing, his nervous system permanently alert. Rest became something theoretical, not attainable. On set, the transformation was absolute. Crew members described the experience as unsettling, not because Heath was unprofessional, but because he was too present. When the cameras rolled, he was no longer performing madness. He was inhabiting it. The laugh was not rehearsed. It emerged unpredictably, raw and abrasive, as if tearing its way out. His physical movements were erratic, his posture unstable, his eyes unnervingly vacant and focused at the same time. Director Christopher Nolan later remarked that Heath's commitment was unlike anything he had witnessed. He was fearless, inventive, and relentless. Each take brought something new, something darker, something more precise. And yet, between scenes, Heath did not fully return. The Joker lingered. Conversations were brief, smiles were rare. It was as if removing the mask required an effort that cost him more than keeping it on. The irony was cruel. As Heath descended deeper into psychological strain, his work ascended toward greatness. Every day of suffering translated into cinematic brilliance. Every sleepless night sharpened the performance audiences would later praise as revolutionary. The Joker became terrifying not because of makeup or dialogue, but because the chaos felt authentic. Viewers sensed it instinctively. This was not imitation. This was exposure. But authenticity has a price when taken too far. To cope with insomnia and anxiety, Heath began relying more heavily on medication. What started as a temporary solution slowly became routine. Prescription drugs promised rest, silence, relief. Instead, they added another layer of fragility, saying, the balance between control and collapse grew increasingly unstable. Those around him noticed the warning signs: fatigue etched into his face, weight loss, emotional withdrawal. But in an industry built on momentum, pauses are rare, and concern often arrives too late. As filming concluded, there was no relief. The Joker did not release him simply because production ended. Heath spoke privately about feeling unsettled, unable to fully detach. The character had demanded a psychological openness that could not be closed easily. He had opened doors inside himself without knowing how to lock them again. Tragically, the world only saw the result, not the process. Audiences would later marvel at the performance, calling it fearless, iconic, immortal, when few understood that the same qualities that made it unforgettable were the ones that left Heath exposed. The Joker did not destroy him in a single dramatic moment. It eroded him slowly, invisibly, through exhaustion, pressure, and silence. And then, without warning, the story stopped. News of Heath Ledger's death spread like a shockwave through Hollywood and beyond. Confusion turned to disbelief. Disbelief turned to grief. He was 28 years old, at the peak of his powers, in possession of a performance that would soon redefine cinematic villainy, yet never able to witness the world's reaction to it. The tragedy was not just that he died young, it was that he died unheard. The signs had been there, the suffering had been quiet, and the role that gave the world one of its greatest characters had taken more from its creator than anyone realized. As the Joker would later say on screen, "Why so serious?" The question, haunting in retrospect, felt less like a taunt and more like a warning no one fully understood in time. In the final weeks of his life, Heath Ledger existed in a fragile space between exhaustion and responsibility. The Joker had been completed, but rest never arrived. His mind remained restless, his body worn thin by months of psychological strain and chronic insomnia. Friends later recalled that he seemed tired in a way sleep alone could not fix, alert on the surface, but internally depleted. Despite the growing weight, Heath continued working. He spoke about future projects, about directing, about stories he still wanted to tell. And then there was no grand farewell, no sense that he believed the end was near. Like many artists driven by purpose, he assumed endurance was enough, that pushing forward as he always had would somehow carry him through. On the night that would become his last, the circumstances were painfully ordinary. No dramatic confrontation, no public collapse, just a quiet room, a fatigued body, and a lethal combination of prescription medications meant to calm a mind that would not slow down. When the news broke, it felt unreal. Hollywood froze. Fans around the world struggled to comprehend how someone so alive on screen could be gone so suddenly in reality. Tributes poured in immediately. Directors, co-stars, and actors spoke not only of his talent, but of his kindness, his humility, and his seriousness about craft. Many admitted, with painful hindsight, that they had underestimated how much pressure he carried alone. The tragedy was not just loss, it was recognition arriving too late. Heath Ledger did not die chasing fame. He died chasing honesty in his art, believing he could withstand the cost. And in that quiet room, far from applause and cameras, the world lost not just an actor, but a voice that still had so much left to say. When The Dark Knight was finally released, the world witnessed what Heath Ledger never could. The Joker was instantly recognized as one of the greatest performances in cinematic history. Terrifying, magnetic, unforgettable. Anarchy given form, chaos given intelligence. The role redefined what a villain could be and what acting at its highest level demanded. The Academy Award came posthumously. The applause was thunderous. The praise unanimous. Yet beneath the celebration lay an uncomfortable truth. The price of that brilliance had been devastatingly high. Heath Ledger became immortal through a performance he did not live to see honored. His legacy, however, is more than a single role. It is a reminder that greatness and vulnerability often coexist. That intensity without protection can become dangerous. That silence around mental health, especially in creative industries, can be fatal. Heath Ledger showed the world what fearless artistry looks like. His life asks us a harder question in return. How do we protect those who give us everything? If his story moved you, disturbed you, or stayed with you long after the screen went dark, take a moment to remember him. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to keep these stories alive. Because legends do not disappear when they die. They disappear only when we stop telling their stories.